Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Nick, your host of On the Scene with Martini. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and don't forget, you are the scene.
Before we get started, I want to give a thank you to our sponsor, A Day in the Life Records, run by Dan. Dan has a rich, deep history in the music scene and owns a gorgeous record store located in downtown Lancaster. Dan specializes in all things alternative, hardcore, punk, and so much more. Make sure to check him out, buy a record, and enjoy some fresh tunes.
Hey guys, what's up? It's Nick, On the Scene with Martini. Today I got Steve from Minor Threat, Govt Issue, and Poisonous H. How you doing, Steve?
I'm all right. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great, honestly. I really appreciate you coming on.
Absolutely.
It's awesome having someone from Minor Threat, which I feel like most of the people would consider like the most iconic hardcore band, if not one of them of all time. So it's a real honor.
Thank you. Absolutely. It's my pleasure.
So I know that you've had a pretty extensive music background growing up in DC, just from like playing bass, being in bands in general, producing itself. But like, what was your introduction to music itself?
Oh boy. The reality is, my introduction to music was in utero, and it was the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. My mother was pregnant with me, and she said, the Beatles played twice on Ed Sullivan on February 9th, 1964. Two 10-minute segments, and she said for both 10-minute segments, I was a normally active baby, I was silent. I didn't move. She said, "Oh my God," she said to my father, "He's listening, and he's going to be a musician." And my dad said, "Well, that's problem. That's very likely." In my mother's family, there were lots of musicians, lots of artists. My dad was a DJ with an extensive record collection. So it didn't seem that strange, but it was, because she knew I was a boy because I didn't jump around, move. I was silent and I didn't do anything. And so it all turned out to be absolutely true. The Beatles are my favorite band, and I definitely was a musician. But the real intro to music for me was my dad's record collection. My dad was a DJ on a radio station called WPIK here in DC. And he got all the promo copies of all this great mid 60s music. He had all the great rock bands, but he also had Frank Sinatra and, all that kind of stuff. And I didn't even really, I remember this vaguely, but the story is that I used to like to play by myself in the basement of this house, this townhouse we lived in. And my dad's record collection was down there, and my mother left me alone one afternoon, and there was no sound. There was nothing. Normally I was making noise. I was doing something. She knew I was alive, and there was no sound. So she ran downstairs, and I pulled my dad's record collection out, and I had all these records out on the covers, and I wasn't hurting them. I was just, she said, essentially worshiping them. I was just down on my hands and knees, staring at the labels and the covers with my mouth open, like, "Oh, where have you been all my life?" I was 2 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, "Oh, A, wow, that's amazing. And B, oh shit. I got to get all these back in their covers, and before my husband gets home, or he's going to freak out," which he wouldn't have done. But nonetheless, she was worried. So she did, and then she turned this huge record cabinet against the wall. And the next day she told my dad, and he thought it was funny. Next day she leaves me downstairs in the basement, and it gets quiet again. And she comes down, and I've pulled the record cabinet around at 2 years old, and taken all the records back out, and I'm worshiping them again. And so she and my dad were like, "Okay, we're going to get him his own records and a little record player." And I would just sit for hours by myself in the basement listening to music. And I don't remember a time in my life where I didn't, I just wasn't music. There literally is no conscious period of my life where that wasn't the case. And my parents split up when I was 2, not too long after this, actually. I don't think it was the causation, but
Yeah.
um, yeah, it was just me and my mom for a long time. Yeah,
Mhm.
I know. God damn it. God damn it, Casey, get him away from my records. No, it was nothing like that. But my dad was a dog. Um, and it was just my mother and myself, and we moved into an apartment, just the two of us, near where my grandparents lived in Falls Church, Virginia, which is a suburb outside, about 10 minutes outside of DC. And I was always very close to my maternal grandparents, and my aunt and my 2 uncles, my mother's younger siblings. My mother's the oldest. I'm the oldest of her children, and the oldest of my generation, by 7 years. And so, I had my own room. I had my records. I had my record player. Uh, and I just love music. My uncle Nick, who was 10 years older than me, my mother's youngest brother, he played guitar, and he was a cool, groovy 60s teenager. He was in high school in the mid 60s, and he was also the star quarterback of the football team. So he was like the coolest guy you could be around, but he
Yeah.
wasn't he was a cool jock who had an amazing record collection, who had a guitar. He fit the bill. And I went to this private school, and I would go, and my grandmother was an educator, and her high school was right around the corner from my school. So I would go spend time with her after school. Then I'd go to her house after school, and I'd hang out with my uncle, and we'd sit in his room and listen to records. And his record collection was the Stones and the Beatles and the Who and the Byrds, especially, and the Buffalo Springfield, and every great band, mid 60s band with a great catalog you can think of. And he would play the guitar, and he'd play the songs and show me this is what you do. And I was about 3 years old when I stole his guitar for the first time. And they found me in this little back room, trying to play. And I knew that's what I was going to do. And everyone in my family was like, oh, okay, that's it. It's like Stevie plays guitar, and I just love music. It got so, I got so obsessive that I would only bring records to show and tell. My favorite record to bring to show and tell was Rubber Soul because of the cool cover. And I still have here with me the report cards of my teacher saying, please, please, Mrs. Grip, do not let Steve bring records to show and tell anymore. And it never worked. And I would show up the next show and tell, and I would have 5 more records from my huge collection. And I already had a huge collection, partly thanks to my dad, partly because I would ask my mom, I want my own Beatles records,
Hmm.
not just Uncle Nick's records. And so it just kept going and kept going and kept going. And there was never a period of time where I didn't doubt that I'd be a musician. And I went through elementary school, and I went into junior high, and I got my first bass. I wanted to play bass. There was no question. I wanted to play the bass. Paul McCartney played the bass. I wanted to play the bass like Paul McCartney. That was what I wanted to do. And my grandparents' next door neighbor, they had bought their son a P bass in the mid 60s, and he never played it. So Thanksgiving 1976, they gave it to me. Just here, give it to Stevie. He wants, because my grandmother said he wants a bass. Well, we've got a bass. We've got a bass in the back room. Give it to Steve. And it was a candy apple red 65p bass. I mean, like the cherriest of basses on earth. And I just threw myself into learning how to play. And everything fell by the wayside. I didn't give a crap about school. The only friends I had were guys who liked music. Um, my mother remarried in 1970, and my life kind of went into the shitter at that point. My stepfather was an abusive alcoholic narcissist who kicked the shit out of me for 12 years. And my own, what had always been my happy place, my safe space, which was music, became my only safe place. And I had in the basement of our house, I had my room and I had I had all my stuff. And it was where I could go to get away from the insanity of my life. And so it wasn't really surprising that I was drawn to music that had a certain amount of theatricality and physicality.
Hmm.
And the next band that I became obsessed with was Kiss. I was exactly the right age to be a first generation Kiss fan. I got Alive for Christmas 1975, right after it came out, and I wanted to be Gene Simmons. I wanted to, I went from Paul McCartney to Gene Simmons. And when you think about it, there's not that much of a difference, playing wise. Super melodic players, super creative players, very different approach. But I love the theatricality of their music and the physicality of it. I got it. I was like, oh, all right, this is cool. And I am certainly not unique in the DC punk pantheon for guys who loved Kiss. All of us loved Kiss. Almost all of us were at the 1970s, December 19th, 1977 show here when they played the Alive 2 tour with AC/DC opening.
That's a wild tour.
There was almost everyone I know from the DC punk team was at that show. Jeff was at that show. Eddie Janney, Guy Picciotto, all the guys. So many people were at that show, and seeing that show, it was the second show I saw. The first show I saw was Wings, Paul McCartney and Wings, in 1976, and then in '77 I saw Kiss, and I was just like, okay, yeah, I've got to get in on this somehow. But the other thing that I wanted to do was play original music, and most people just wanted to play covers, and I wasn't interested in that. And so I bided my time, and it wasn't very long. I think 77 to 79. By 79, I had discovered punk rock. I mean, I knew about punk rock. I I heard about punk rock in early 1977 through Hit Parader magazine, a little blurb about this band called the Sex Pistols, and had a picture of them playing the 100 Club. And I thought, and the way they described the music, I was like, because I'd gone from Kiss to The Who, because that was another band that was theatrical and had a very physical way of approaching their music. And their bass player blew my mind, John Entwistle. And I was like, oh, okay, this is the guy, not Paul McCartney, not Gene Simmons. I want to be fucking John Entwistle. I get this guy. And I had a P bass. I could make that sound. And I thought, okay, that's cool. So I just dedicated my life to learning how to play those songs so I could have a vocabulary. And I just, I found about punk rock, and I was really curious, but it was kind of scary at the same time. It sounded kind of scary, but it sounded really interesting. And I have a cousin who is a guy named Mark Noon. And Mark is the lead singer in essentially what is one of the first indie bands in America, certainly the first punk-oriented band in DC, called the Slicky Boys. And the Slicky Boys they're basically the band that inspired everybody, including the Bad Brains. And it was their guitar player, Kim Kane, who discovered the Bad Brains. He's the one who found the Bad Brains. He's the one who took them into Inner Ear and had Don Zentera and Skip Groff record them. And he's the one who got them on the opening bill for The Damned when they played DC for the first time in '79. And, he was my cousin. So he was sort of my Yoda,
Yeah.
so to speak, to put it in Star Wars terms. He was my Yoda. And I still to this day will describe him when we hang out. I will describe him that way to people. He was like, "There's this great punk scene in DC. They're all kids your age. They're on to something, and you should probably get involved in this." And I thought, all right. So I went to check it out, and he was right. I was like, oh, okay. Not only do I get it, and not only do I love these bands, But they have this philosophy that me and my punk friends back in Northern Virginia have too, which is that we're straight. I don't know why. And maybe it was in the water. I have no idea. Maybe it was because all of our parents had high profile DC jobs and were alcoholics. I don't know. But all of us seem to gravitate towards this being our punk rock rebellion. And before I even knew those guys were doing that, my friends and I were doing that. That was our way of rebelling. And in the early 80s, that was a hell of a rebellion for a teenager, because you were instantly going to lose a lot of friends. You were going to lose a lot of friends being a punk, but you were going to lose even more friends if you didn't drink beer on the weekends. So I started going to shows in 1980, and I saw some amazing shows, and it just stoked the fire. And my friend Kevin and I formed our first band, and we were a punk band in DC, not in DC, in Northern Virginia. And we built up a huge following between 1980 and 1982. We were, in our world, we were huge, but we never played in DC because we weren't a hardcore band. We were a punk band. I loved hardcore. I thought hardcore was great, but hardcore was a developing concept. When the Teen Idols and the Untouchables, and then when that wasn't hardcore, that didn't exist. That was punk rock. No one was talking in those terms. They didn't start talking in those terms until the Teen Idols did a West Coast tour in the summer of 1980. And that's when they saw the Circle Jerks. That's when they met Black Flag. That's when they saw TSOL. That's when they met those guys. They played in LA, they played in San Francisco, and they came back. And when they came back, they had, bandanas on their boots, and they were doing this thing called the slam. And we were like, okay. And, they were shaving their heads. We'd all had spiky hair up to that point. And then it was like, hell yeah. This is just this is the level up. And this is ours, because we could write hardcore with a capital D and a capital C and make it our own, and this is our contribution, because they came back and they weren't, they came back, and it still wasn't called hardcore. That was the Teen Idols and the Untouchables way of going, we're going to be harder than any of these other bands. We're going to be hardcore. And that was how that came to be. So it was very much a DC thing, but it was bred from their experiences in Southern California. And by the end of 1980, the Teen Idols had broken up, and Minor Threat was on the drawing board. It was a thing where there were two high schools that fed the DC punk scene, Wilson High School and Georgetown Day School. And the first pairing of the Georgetown Day School and Wilson High School kids was Minor Threat. Ian and Jeff went to Wilson, and Brian and Lyle went to GDS. But so did Mike Hampton from Faith, and all those guys, Guy Picciotto. Those were all guys from GDS. And it was that fall of 1980 where all those forces came together, and my buddies and I came in from Northern Virginia, that this whole thing coalesced into an actual punk rock hardcore scene. And I remember, I knew Brian, and I remember, talking about this new band he was doing, and it sounded really exciting. I was thrilled. And when we first saw them, it was like, oh shit, we'd love the Teen Idols. They were fun. They were a fun band. They weren't a dangerous band. They were a fun band. Mm-hmm. Minor Threat was dangerous. And SOA, which was Henry's band, that was dangerous. I was like, oh, okay, cool. Wow, we're on a different level now. And it was mind-blowing. And at that point in time, it gave me personally the bravery to stand up to my stepfather finally. And I shaved my head for the first time at a show, and on a Friday night, and I had to get up to go to work on Saturday morning. And my stepfather came in, and I had my head shaved, and he freaked, and he threw me, he picked me up and threw me across the kitchen. And I stood up, and I walked over to him, and I clocked him, and I knocked him out cold. And that was that. My punk rock journey was complete. and he never touched me again. He never even spoke to me. And I lived with him for another 2 years. And it was just that moment for me. That was my punk rock a moment where I like won. I fucking won. And at that point, I just jumped in with both feet. I was all in. I was going to shows every weekend. I was playing shows every weekend. I was, writing songs. I was recording them. I couldn't get enough of it. This was what I was born to do. And yeah, that was the thing. And in late 1981, I just talked to Ian about this today. He didn't even know. One of my friends, and Minor Threat broke up for the first time in the fall of '81, and we were all fucking devastated. It was just the worst. And SOA broke up too. And I thought, well, last time this happened, all these great new bands formed, so maybe that'll happen this time too. And so Faith came out of SOA. So score one on that. We're like, okay, great. Even better band, much better band. I always loved Alec Mackay. Alec was one of my favorite guys, favorite front man, and he was in this great new band. And I was like, yep, sign me up. I love it. But nothing was coming out of Minor Threat. And Brian had joined GI, and that was cool. He made GI 10 times a better band than they were. Lyle was at school, so he wasn't doing anything except his roommate. His roommate was a guy named Steve Albini. So that's how that connection came to be. I was like, what? Are you fucking kidding me? And the guys from, oh God, I can't think of the band's name. It'll come to me. They were across the hall from Steve and Lyle. But we were expecting something to come from Ian and Jeff. We were really hoping. And they had this band called either Grand Union, if you listen to Jeff, or Skewbald, if you listen to Ian, typical of their relationship, as I came to find out for myself personally. And they had this band, and Eddie Janney, who would later go on to be in Faith and Rites of Spring and Happy Go Licky. He was the guitar player, and he had been in the Untouchables, which was Ian's younger brother, Alex band, who were amazing, really good band. He's just a great guitar player. And then a friend of mine who went to high school out with me in Northern Virginia, a guy named John Falls, was the bass player. I thought, okay, cool. And, it sounded really interesting. And all the word coming back from John was that this was really a good band. And I didn't doubt it, considering who was in it. But it just never seemed to go anywhere. They moved to Discord House that fall of '81. And they were, they were the first band to rehearse there. And they all lived there except for John. And so I thought, yeah, that all makes sense. And nothing came of it. And so by early December, what a really good mutual friend said, hey, Skewbald, John Falls just quit Skewbald and they need a bass player. Are you interested? And I said, yeah, fuck yeah. And I said, do you know any of their songs? Do you have any tapes? He was like, no, they don't have anything. I was like, shit. All right. I said, well, look. And at that point in my eyes hadn't come out yet. It was going to come out in like 2 weeks. But I had the first 7-inch. And I said, well, you know what? I'll just sit down and learn all the Minor Threat songs. And at least they'll be able to see what I'm capable of. So I spent a weekend. I already knew the songs. I'd heard them 1,000 times live. I'd listened to the record over and over again. So I knew them. I just hadn't actually learned them. I learned them all in that weekend. And I just practiced them. And 2 weeks later, And My Eyes came out, and I got that. I bought it from Jeff at a show at 930 Club, and I went home and I learned that. And I remember from the first second I heard that record, I went, oh my God, they leveled up. As good as that first 7-inch is, to the first notes of In My Eyes, you're like, okay, wow. And then Brian's bass line comes in, and I'm like, that's Motown. That's fucking Motown in a punk rock song, but it works. I'm like, yeah. Give me more of that. But it's like, it's over. They're gone, but at least I can learn this, and I can go to Ian and Jeff and say, here, this is what I can do. I can be your bass player. And then the word got back to me that they weren't going to try to be a band. They just gave up. And I thought, shit. Well, I know all these songs, so I'll keep them in my back pocket. And I kept playing with my band, and I was having a great time. And then come spring of 1982, I'm a senior in high school. I'm about to graduate. And by the skin of my teeth, by the way. And I hear from Brian, keep it on the DL, but I'm leaving GI because Lyle's coming home from school and we're reforming Minor Threat. And I was like, oh, thank God. And I wasn't thinking because now I can be the bass player in Minor Threat, because why would I do that? Brian, my friend, was the bass player in Minor Threat. And I thought, yeah, cool, great. We get another chance at Minor Threat. That's how can that go? How can that be a bad thing? And they played their first show, which was opening for Bad Brains, and it was amazing and it was great. And then they played again and it was great. And they played a couple more times and it was great to have them back. And then they left on tour. And so for that entire summer of '82, I graduated. I moved out of my house the same day. I was like, I'm out of here. I'm never coming back. One of my good friends, his mother was a friend of my grandmother's, who she was a teacher too. And she was like, and my grandmother had said, my grandmother was dying at the time. And she'd always been my big champion. My maternal grandmother had been my champion. She'd always like been my biggest backer. Besides my mother, she was my biggest backer, and she was ill. And so she asked, Steve's got to get out of this fucking house. He's going to be graduating soon. Do you think he could come live with you and your son, who was one of my best friends? She said, yeah. So I got out of the house. I had a job, was making money. I was going to show, like in the summer of '82 was the golden era for DC punk rock. There was a show practically every night. And that was when Scream got big. And Scream had been they're a Northern Virginia band. Matter of fact, my grandmother was the guidance counselor for the guys in Scream when they went to her high school. So I'd known those guys for a long time, but I was a huge fan. And Scream didn't translate in DC. And my band didn't translate in DC. So we all sort of banded together in Northern Virginia. And we just loved Scream. We knew Scream was a great band. But that summer, while Minor Threat were on tour, Scream took over. And GI, had a new lineup. And the new lineup was great. And Faith were killing it. And everyone was killing it. And it was just such a great time to be alive and in DC. And then there's a sister music scene to the DC punk scene, and that's the go-go scene. And the go-go scene was our homegrown R&B music. It's very specific to DC. And we all loved the go-go bands. We all went to go see the go-go bands. We were all friends with the go-go bands. Minor Threat's last show was playing with Trouble Funk, the biggest DC go-go band. And they used to play a Wednesday night residency at this club called the Paragon 2 in Glover Park, which is the neighborhood just north of Georgetown. And most of the guys in the DC punk scene were from Georgetown or from Glover Park. And so, there was a lot of talk about going to see Trouble Funk at Paragon 2, but no one did it. No one did it. And one afternoon I had the day off. It was a Wednesday at the end of August, 1982. And a friend of mine from high school, a guy named Mike Ryan, called me up and said, you've got nothing to do today. Let's go to Georgetown. Let's just go hang, because Georgetown's where the DC punks hung out. We would go there no matter what. And he was like, let's go, but let's go to Paragon 2 and see Trouble Funk. He's like, we've been talking about this for like a year. Let's go. Let's finally do it. I said, yeah. So we got on the bus and rode down to DC and went into Georgetown, and we were just, walking up the street, and there's an intersection of Emma Street and Wisconsin Avenue, and just north of there was this great record store. And we were going to go there, and that's where John Stab from GI worked. And we would always go to this record store to say hi to John before we went and did anything else. So we got to go say hi to John. So we're walking up the street, and when I got across the street from the record store, I saw that Brian Baker was home from tour, which I didn't know, and Mike Hampton from The Faith were out in front talking. And I thought, oh, cool, I get to go see Brian. Great. I haven't seen Brian in like a month and a half. So I went across the street, and they were talking about guitars, and I just sort of barged into their conversation. And, we're talking, and I think I'm going to go see John in a few minutes. And Brian looked, and we started talking about guitars, and and Brian said, "Oh, wait a minute, you play, don't you?" I said, "Yeah, I play." He's like, "Are you in a band right now?" I'm like, "No." He was like, "Because my band had broken up at the end of summer '82, so I was just free." And he said, "Hold on a second," and he went into the record store. What I didn't know was that John was on tour. He was GI were on the West Coast, and being the nice guy that he is, Ian was taking his place at this record store while he was gone. So the door opens to the record store, and out comes Ian. I'm like, "What the fuck? What's going on?" And Ian looked at Brian, and Ian knew me from my band. He knew my cousin. He knew me from my band. And he looked at Brian and said, "Yeah, all right, that's cool." I was like, "What's cool?" And Brian said, "I'll tell you in a minute. What are you guys doing?" And I said, "Well, we're going to go see Trouble Funk tonight." He's like, "Really?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "You want to come?" He's like, "Yeah, I want to come. But first we just go back to my house." And on the way, he said, "Look, after we were on tour this summer, we hung out with Black Flag a lot. And Lyle and I fell in love with the 5-piece Black Flag. And I decided I don't want to play bass in the band anymore. I want to play second guitar. We're going to be a 5-piece, and we need a bass player." And Ian said that was okay if I found the bass player. Ian wasn't going to go looking for him. They weren't going to go asking their friends. He's like, "You have to find somebody that no one would think of." And he said, "I think I just found him." And I went, "Are you fucking kidding me?" He said, "No." And so we went back to his house, and because I had those songs in my back pocket for 8 months at that point, I was like, "Yeah, sure." And I said, "Well, I can play all the songs." He's like, "You can?" I said, "Yeah." And I just sat down and went, he had his bass there. I just ripped through everything. And he was like, "Oh, fuck. We don't even have to rehearse. You know the songs." I was like, "Yep." So we hung out. We had a great time. We went to go see Trouble Funk. We had a great time. I spent the night at his house. The next day we went to Discord House. And we went to the basement, and he and Jeff and I practiced, just the three of us. And from the very first note, Jeff and Brian looked at each other and were like, "Yep, that's it. We found him." And I just couldn't fucking believe it. Like, are you kidding me? I was just this kid, coming to Georgetown to go see Trouble Funk. And the next thing I know, I'm in Minor Threat. And the next day, I had to go home. The next day, Lyle and Brian came out and got me and brought me back to Discord. And Jeff and Lyle and Brian and I played. And Lyle was like, "Oh shit, yeah, this is the kid." And and Ian was already down. I mean, he knew me, and he was already like down. And when they told him, "Look, we don't have to teach him anything. He knows all the songs. He knows them better than we know them." And that was that. And that was the next year of my life. And it was it was a very interesting year. I went from the frying pan into the fire. I knew that they didn't get along. I just didn't know how profoundly they didn't get along.
Just in terms of Minor Threat as a whole.
Oh boy, it was. I entered the scene I entered into at that place in the movie was this sort of perfect storm where they had gotten back together again. There was that high of them being back together again. Then there was the reality of their first tour, because they tried to tour in '81, but it had fallen apart. So they just gotten back from their first solid American tour. It was a month-long tour, but they had already figured out that being in a van together did not bring out the best in any of them. Ian and Jeff were already, they've been friends for years, and they were partners in Discord. And every band they've been in together. But they are very different people. And that fall, there was a lot of pressure on Ian and Jeff. Discord, the phone at Discord, one of the things that struck me about hanging out at Discord House all the time at that point, because I used to hang out there from time to time, but now I was there all the time. The phone never stopped ringing. Phone never stopped ringing. There was no lit up. And it was always, hey, do you want to play this show? It was just constant. So the pressure on Jeff, especially since, Ian was working and Jeff was there, he started to drink and he started to smoke pot. And I didn't even know this. And it started to make his judgment a little shaky. And Ian really got mad, but he internalized it. They didn't fight about it. They internalized it. And, honestly, we were all the beneficiaries of that internalization because that's all the songs are Not a Step. All those songs are Not a Step are fuck you, Jeff. You betrayed me. Someday we'll look back and laugh. It's just this whole thing. And I thought, oh, geez, and Brian, I have been in a lot of bands since 1982. A lot of bands. And to this day, and I've been in bands that did not get along. I've been in dysfunctional bands. I've been in functional bands. To this day, I've never met or heard two people who are as cruel as Brian and Lyle, to each other in particular. But to anyone who got in their way when they were fighting in particular. And who that person usually was? Me.
Yeah. Being the new person on the block.
Who was, yeah. And I, physically in that basement, which was not very big, I'm the one who was in between the two of them. So when they started hurling insults at each other, and they did that on the regular, and it was the most fucking disgusting, cruel, unnecessary vileness you've ever heard. People, even my ex-wife and I didn't talk to each other like this, and that was a really unhealthy relationship. But the thing is, at the same time, I'm going, yes, but I'm in Minor Threat. But oh my God, what is wrong with these two guys? I'd known them separately, but together, I'd never seen anything like it. I still have never seen anything like it to this day. And there were a number of times when guitars flew across the room and they didn't hit their intended target. They hit me because I'm the one in the middle, and I'm not this physically, I'm telling you the truth. Once Brian threw his guitar at Lyle and he pulled his Marshall over on top of me. I mean, it was just like, because I was sitting on the floor because practice was over and I thought everything was cool. And then all of a sudden, and a lot of their rivalries, a lot of their problems went back to high school, went back to the way that they didn't get along in high school. And these days, I understand why that was. And, Brian, Lyle, and I in particular were all seriously abused children. We were physically and mentally abused children, severely. And the way that trauma, which is real-time trauma, because, Lyle still lived at home. Brian still lived at home. I had moved out. I had that freedom. I had that distance. And I was healing. And I'd spent that whole summer healing. And then all of a sudden I jump into this band and I'm back in the dysfunction. But it's my friends now. It's not, my asshole stepdad. It's these guys who I really respect, but now I understand it. I mean, they were still at home. They were still getting shit. Lyle especially, because Lyle's parents were straight up DC lawyers. And when he decided to quit school and move back to DC to reform his high school punk band, because Minor Threat was his high school punk band, his parents were not happy. And they put a lot of pressure on him to make it work. This better succeed, asshole, or you're in trouble. And so Lyle worked his ass off. He took all that onto his shoulders to make the second coming of Minor Threat succeed, and this new 5-piece version too. And so what he did was he set about, because he was the writer, he was the songwriter, and he was a brilliant songwriter and a brilliant guitar player. I learned so much from him. And he just, I would get to practice kind of early because I was good. I was chomping at the bit, and he would start, and he would get there a little after me, and he'd come down that whole summer, that whole fall of '82. He kept coming in with songs, and I kept going, "What the fuck?" He came in with "It Follows," and I was like, He's like, "I want you to open this one. You just should start with the bass." Okay, great. And then he came in with "Think Again," and I was like, "Holy shit!" And then he came in with "Betray." And I went, "Oh, wow. This is the song we're going to be known for. This is the one. Everyone's going to remember Betray, because this is monumental. This is a 4-minute punk song, hardcore song, and you never get bored. There's never a drop off in energy. It just kicks your ass from beginning to end, but it was innovative. It was new. This is all from the mind of Lyle Presler because he was working under this pressure. Lyle was working, I was working. Brian was still in high school. Brian still had a year of high school to finish. And so it was just this, and Ian would sit in the office, which was not too far, from the basement at Discord House. And we played so loud that, everyone in the neighborhood heard us, but um, he would sit upstairs writing lyrics while we worked out the music. Because, we worked, Lyle would bring in the bones of the song, and then Brian and Jeff and I would arrange it. We were all really good at doing head arrangements based off of Lyle's songs, which didn't need a lot of help. He would come in, and they would just be so good. And Ian would just be upstairs writing lyrics, and then he'd come downstairs and go, "What do you think of this?" And it'd be like, "Oh my God." Then he'd bring in the lyrics to "It Follows," and then he'd bring in the lyrics to "Think Again," and then he brought in the lyrics to "Betray," and then look back and laugh. And we were all like, "Oh my God," we were making, I just knew, hope this is gonna be monumental. But for Lyle, it was like, "Got to make it work, got to make it work," And now I can have a lot of empathy for that 19-year-old. At 61, I have a lot of empathy for that 19-year-old. At the time, it was like, "Oh my God, dude, you're giving me a migraine." Just mellow out just the tiniest bit. It'll be okay. But for him, he couldn't. He couldn't. It had to be go, 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 go. And when he would get really wound up, Brian, who is a very pithy individual, uh, and I'm also a very pithy, smart-assy individual. And together, we were hell on fucking wheels. We were already best friends. And when you put us together, it was really bad. And Brian would start giving Lyle shit. He would start mocking him or being like, I never joined in. I couldn't do it. I mean, I just didn't want it. I didn't want that hell coming on my head. But Brian didn't give a fuck. And so there would be these amazing moments where we would just be killing it. And then Lai would, someone would blow a note and Lai would start screaming, "God damn it!" Because this had to work right away. And like we were all really good musicians. We were all top tier musicians. All of us were. So to make a mistake was a rare thing. And we were just learning these songs a lot of the time. It didn't take us long to have them down. But if anything went wrong, it was just like temper tantrum central. And Brian would start getting smart assy, and then it would just all go to hell. And then somehow we would get back into it. But it was just, it was like, it was what the Dickens quote, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Because it was the most amazing thing I'd ever experienced, and it sucked ass at the same time. Holy shit. And you had Ian and Jeff's relationship getting weird, and Brian and Lyle's relationship was always weird. And who's in the middle? Me, going, "What? I just want to play punk rock with you guys. I don't want this shit." But we kept at it, and we got our act together, and in January we went in to Don's, to Inner Ear, and in one night recorded Out of Step. We were so tight. We had been playing shows every weekend for months. We've been adding new shows to every show, new songs to every show since September. That by the time we got to the first week of January 9th, 1983 to be exact, we had it down. And we cut that album live. It was cut completely live. You know, Don had a 4-track studio until the spring of '82, and he got an 8-track. So when the first 2 7-inches were recorded, they would record the music, and then Ian would go out and record the vocals later because they didn't have the tracks to do it live. They'd have to bounce things down and and finagle stuff. Now we had 8 tracks, so you could have 3 tracks of drums, track of bass, 2 tracks of guitars, track of vocals, and then track open for overdubs. And we just went in, and in about 4 hours, we recorded the whole record, and including the songs that finally came out on the 7-inch a couple years back, "In My Eyes" and "Filler," um, and that was that. Ian sang live. The bass, drums, and guitars on that record are completely live. There's not any fixing at all. We didn't fix anything. We made no mistakes. We just didn't make mistakes. And Look Back and Laugh was the first time we'd ever played the song all the way through. We'd been rehearsing it for weeks because that was Frankenstein together from like 4 different songs. And we had, kind of been putting it together, and we'd never heard Ian sing it. We didn't have a PA system in the basement, so we never heard him. He was just upstairs writing the words and getting them down. And when he sang it that time, that was the first time he'd even sang it. 1 take, boom. And every song on that record's 1 take. We did every song in 1 take. We were done in 4 hours. The next day we went in and did some vocal overdubs, and Brian did some guitar leads. The leads on Cashing In he did the next day, and that was it. And we mixed it, and then we went on tour. And this tour, unlike their earlier tour, was going to be 2 months, 2 months solid. There was a huge people wanted us, and we had a new record, and we had a new lineup, and people were really anxious to hear. And we played everywhere you could play in America that had a punk scene. If there were 20 kids in that punk scene in Charlotte, North Carolina, all 20 came. If there were 5,000 in Los Angeles, all 5,000 of them came. It was amazing. And, we played small shows, we played huge shows. A lot of the times on that tour, the smaller shows we played were the better shows because people really, their devotion was complete. And there were only, 30 or 40 of them. And it was amazing. Shows in Chapel Hill, shows in Charlotte, North Carolina in particular. There was a bunch of great small shows. And then by the time we got to the West Coast, the shows were enormous. And those shows weren't necessarily as fun. They were chaos most of the time. And a lot of times they got shut down early, which was kind of a bummer. We hated that when it happened because we wanted to play, because we played every song we had. There were no encores. We played every song we knew, and then we got off. But the drives, with rare exceptions, were not much fun. The times when we weren't on stage, even the times when we were on stage, because there's plenty of video evidence of Lyle flipping out on stage. Like one thing going slightly wrong could set him into a tantrum that it was hard for him to recover himself from. And I always felt kind of bad because it must suck to have that little ability to control your emotions. Because nothing that happened was that bad. Nothing. I recently someone sent me a clip of the roller rink show from Los Angeles in April of '83. And we were trying an experiment. Bad Brains could do this, where they would just look at each other and start a song. It was unbelievable. I mean, it was so overwhelming emotionally to see a band like that clued into each other. And so we decided, let's try this with Betray. Like pick the worst song you could pick to do that with. And we tried it in Los Angeles and it didn't work. And Lyle just like, and you could see him get angry and you could see me go, fuck. Like, and we still played the shit out of the song. We all came in at the same time and we played the shit out of the song. We just didn't do it the way we wanted to do it. And I look at it now, I'm like, we were all 18 here. 18, 19, 20. That's impressive. A band of that level, but the hardcore, the Beatles of the Beatles of hardcore, essentially. That's impressive shit. But it was life or death in the moment. And I look at it now and I just laugh. I'm like, wow, really? We were that wound up. But it was, I don't know, it was amazing. But by the end of that tour, I was burnt. I was burnt to a cinder. Um, and they decided to make me they decided to make me a scapegoat. Like, all the problems that were going on in the band clearly were Steve. He doesn't fit in. Like, of course I fit in. I fit in perfectly. Holy shit, I fit in personally. I fit in musically. There wasn't anything I didn't contribute to, but it was my fault. And I'm like, you know what? Fine. You know, Ian decided I had to go, but he didn't do it himself. He had Brian do it. And Brian being my friend, it was fine. I was like, I was good to go. I didn't want to be in the band anymore anyway. I saw them on a downward trail, and that they fired me in June and they broke up in September.
Do you
So,
feel like the dysfunctionality of the band kind of though in a way like made you guys have that second run? Like if you guys didn't
oh,
have
absolutely.
that, yeah, like if you guys didn't have that, it
Oh,
would have
yeah.
been a different type of vibe going in, but it might have not been as fun or as successful.
Absolutely. There is no question in my mind, because you look at a lot of other great bands that have that level of dysfunction. The Who, for example. It's what fueled the fire that you saw on stage. That wasn't by accident. That was because of the interactions with the people in the band. And when you hear stories about how the Beatles were all smiles on stage and in front of the cameras, but behind the scenes, it could get a little fraught.
Hmm.
Well, these are guys who've known each other since when? High school. And Minor Threat was guys who'd known each other since when? High school. And the DC punk scene of that era was like the most dysfunctional sock hop you have ever been to in your life. Take your average high school sock hop, dance, whatever, get together and put a bunch of dysfunctional, overly functioning, talented, brilliant kids in the same room, and then add girls. It was just It was just a shit show. And it's a shit show that I feel so blessed to have been a part of. But it was a shit show. Make no mistake. But that's what made it great. And that's what made it last. And that's why we're still talking about it 45 years later. Without that tension, it would not have been as good as it was. It was necessary. And it sucked, but it worked. It made it great. And it's made it last all this time. It's not like people talk less about Minor Threat. They talk more about Minor Threat and Faith and GI and all the other great bands, Rites of Spring. We're still talking about them because the music was great. And what partly fueled that music was dysfunction. And that's what we sang about. We sang about our lives, and our lives were fucked up, and it's in the lyrics. You know, that's punk rock.
For Out of Step, you were saying earlier about how like it only took 4 hours, basically one take. Did you have being that fifth member in a way an odd man out, but like you were still friends with the members in the band at least
Mhm.
individually? Was it
Yeah.
harder for you to contribute in terms of like bass lines and vocals at all, or no? They kind of let
Nope.
you do what
I
you had to
was in
do.
my wheelhouse from the minute I joined that band to the day I left. I was in my wheelhouse because I've been a musician since I could walk, and Brian has been too, and Lyle learned early, and Ian's a prodigy. Most people don't know that. He's a piano prodigy. He's a genius piano player.
I never knew
I mean,
that.
there's a
Yeah.
number of things on Out of Step that are his piano pieces. The intro to Look Back and Laugh is Ian's piano piece that we heard, and we asked if we could borrow it. The Addams Family thing on the Out of Step Outtakes 7 inch, and it's also the end of cashing in on the Out of Step album. It's an Ian piano piece. He's a brilliant piano player, and so you had some incredibly gifted musicians, natural born to be musicians. And I felt completely at home in that milieu because, one of the things that was interesting about the DC punk scene of that era, 81 especially, is that Brian was a very intimidating character. He was very cocky and very sure of himself. And he could be very devastating with a put down if he wanted to be, or he could be incredibly uplifting with a compliment. The thing about Brian that never, a lot of my friends were really intimidated by him. And we'd see him out, in Georgetown, or we'd see him at a show, and they'd all like, I don't want to go talk to that guy. And I go, I'm going to go talk to him. I'm going to go talk to him. And they were like, why? And I said, because I'm every bit as good as that kid. I remember saying that to a friend of mine at a GI show when Brian was playing bass in GI. After mine had broken up the first time, I'm like, I'm every bit as good as that kid. So I'm not intimidated by him. I can be just as pithy as him, and I can play just as good as him. So why should I be intimidated by him? And I think he always appreciated that, because a lot of that was just insecurity. But I didn't know that, and I didn't have a lot of insecurity. And so I was just like, yeah, I'm going to go say, hey, what's up? And that was partly one of the reasons why it made sense to him that I be the guy. It wasn't just my ability to play, which was a huge part of it, but it was also that I wasn't intimidated by it. There was at no point when I was in Minor Threat that I felt like I'm out of my depths here. I'm like, nope. I just wish they were nicer to each other,
Mhm.
you know. But I could play. I never felt for a second like why I wasn't contributing.
Was
And I remember recording Out of Step and being just like, yep, holy shit, here we are doing this.
when you had that period of time when you were not in Minor Threat prior to being in GI, were you still playing in other bands kind of like here and there, or was that kind of a time for like reflection for you?
Before the couple of months, let's say between June and August of 1982, I was not playing in a band. I was healing from 12 years of. I now know that I was healing because my band that I had with my friend Kevin broke up right around the time that I graduated from high school because I graduated before all my friends did. I was a year ahead of them. And I sort of moved on at that point. I needed to move on for a while. And, my home life had been such a horrendous shit show that I spent that 2 or 3 months just healing and practicing. I spent like 8 hours a day practicing. And I had a job, it was like one of the things where I was still practicing 8 hours a day. And just, living, going to shows, being with my friends, going to Wendy's.
Yeah.
Um, seriously, it was just we were just punk rock guys hanging out, going to hang out with girls, at their really nice houses in Bethesda. And it was it was just one of those things where it was just I was just doing that, and then all of a sudden, boom, summer ends, and I'm in Minor Threat, and it's like, okay, everything just got super real, but I'm down for it. I was ready. I spent all that time healing and practicing, and I was good to go. And then after I was fired from Minor Threat, I formed a band called Second Wind with Rich Moore and Bert Kiraz, who had been the rhythm section in the Untouchables, which was Alec Mackay's first band and Eddie Janney's first band. And I played guitar in that band. I've always played guitar and bass, but bass has always been my main instrument. And it just we tried for a year, and people just didn't accept it. They just didn't like it. Hardcore was changing, and we were actually pretty on the cutting edge of doing something different, but we hadn't gotten there yet, and people just didn't get it. And then once again, after I left that band, because that band went on for another, sort of stumbled on for another year or so, but they never really did anything. Um, we put out one record in the spring of '84, which is a very rare album now. But after that, I didn't play. I didn't play. Minor Threat broke up the second time, and Brian and Lyle put this sort of college rock band together called the 400. They were also playing in the Meatmen with Tesco V, but their main focus was this sort of collegey band. Ray Hare from what's the band? The band that Brendan Canty was in. Deadline. Band called Deadline. Was the singer. Graham McCullough from Negative Approach in Michigan was the bass player. And I basically was the road guy. I was the guy who kept everything together, essentially, oddly enough. Considering my role in Minor Threat, I was the guy who kind of kept them, I knew their dynamic so well by then that I was able to sort of get between them without it taking anything out of me. I had nothing, I wasn't in this band, so it didn't matter to me. And that band didn't last very long. No one cared about that band. It didn't last. And then Brian formed Dag Nasty, and Lyle stopped playing punk rock, essentially. And I was there for the birth of Dag Nasty. I wasn't in Dag Nasty, but I was there for the birth of it. And but I didn't play in a band for a year. And I practiced, though. I mean, again, like I always did, still do. Practiced 5 hours yesterday. I was just sort of biding my time. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no clue, but I wanted to do something. I just didn't know what, and I wasn't going to commit myself to anything that didn't feel right. After my experiences up to that point, I was like, yeah, I'm just going to wait. And then in the spring of 1985, John Stabb called me and said, hey, I've got this opportunity to do a show with, but I want to do a cover band, like a really cool punk rock cover band, but not playing punk rock songs, playing punk rock versions of established songs. And will you help me put a band together? I said, sure. So I called Brian up. I said, are you interested? And he said, yeah, I want to play the drums. And Brian's a great drummer. And I said, cool, I'll play bass. And the then bass player in GI, a guy named John Leonard, will play guitar. Great guitar player. So the four of us got together at John Leonard's house, which is where GI practiced at the time, and we banged out this set. And we had all these great songs. We played songs by the Animals. We played songs by the Everly Brothers. We played all this really cool stuff. And we practiced our asses off. And we got really good, and we got a show opening for Rites of Spring, oddly enough, at the University of Maryland. And we went out and we brought our equipment because, Rites of Spring never seemed to have any equipment, but they were always breaking other people's equipment. And Brian and I were like, yeah, if we're going to go out there with our extremely expensive equipment that we've worked really hard to buy, we're going to sit on the stage and being involved in this show. And so we went and we played, and our sound check, just for fucking shits and giggles, we played Wait for the Blackout by the Damned, and we nailed it. I mean, we just fucking nailed it. And remember Guy saying, I'm not 100% sure I want to play. Mike Fellows being like, that's the best bass I've ever heard in my life. I'm like, well, you're more than welcome to borrow it. You're going to be playing out of the same amp, and so we played a great show. We kicked Rites of Spring's ass off the stage. They sucked that night. They were horrendous that night. And I felt bad because I loved Rites of Spring. And then they tried to break our equipment. And we were like, nope. We stepped in at the very last moment. We're like, nope, you're not doing it. And so they weren't able to have their orgasmic finish. And they were very upset about that. Ian thought it was kind of funny. We talked about that again. We talked about that today too. We'd never discussed that before. And so we played we played a handful more shows around town. We got a really good reputation as a great cover band who did, offbeat things. We didn't do what you would expect, and we were really good. And then Brian decided he wanted to form DAG, and he was going to put all of his all of his attention into that, and rightly so, because Dag Nasty is a great band. And was out of the gate. Brian knew what he wanted to do, and he did a great job with it. And so at that point in time, I was sort of left sort of floating around out in space. But John said, "Hey, look, here's the thing. We're having some trouble with John Leonard, our bass player. He has some mental health issues, and he's becoming harder to keep stable, especially on the road. So what we'd like you to do is learn our set as it stands and be his understudy, be his stand-in, be with the band, like roadie for us. But in case anything goes south, step in and be prepared." And so for like a month, I practiced with them, and I knew those GI songs so well already, and I learned them, and I had them down, and they sounded fucking great, and I loved John Leonard's playing. He was a great player. I really liked him as a person too, and it was really hard to watch him go through what he was going through. And I roadied, and I stood behind the SVT, and I just was ready to go. And it happened at what is now the 930 Club.
Mm-hmm.
Was an old radio hall called WUST, where they used to have the big band dances. My grandparents, when they were college students at Catholic University here in DC in the 30s, used to go there to dance. And so they were having big punk rock shows. IMP, who is 930, were putting on punk rock shows. They're big ones. And the Dead Kennedys were in town to play. And so it was going to be Dead Kennedys and GI, and Dag Nasty were going to play their first show. So Dag plays their first show, and they're fucking amazing. And I'm standing behind the amp, and GI starts their set, and within a song, John Leonard he just loses it on stage. And I got him off, and I took the bass, and I made sure that he was in a good, stable place. Tom Lyle, the guitar player, his girlfriend, Kim, now wife, she's just a lovely person. And she's the kind of person who can talk you down. So she had John in hand, and I went out and played the rest of the set, and it killed. And that was it. I was in the band. John couldn't do it anymore, so I was in. And so for the next 2 years, that's what I did. And I loved being in GI. I love being in GI more than Minor Threat because I loved John Stab. He was my buddy. We'd been through a lot together, even by that point in time. And we played together a lot, and we hung out together a lot. We went to the movies, and we chased the same girls, and we had a great time. And we were seriously bonded. So being in a band with him was like just made sense. But the problem is that there was a serious dysfunction in that band too, and that the guitar player and songwriter Tom Lyle, who was a brilliant guitar player and a brilliant songwriter, sound familiar? And John fought literally constantly at practice, in the van, going to get a burger. It didn't matter. They could find an argument in anything. I used to think that Ian and Jeff were the two people who could find an argument. If Ian said blue, Jeff said red. Just because.
Yeah.
Not because he thought it was red, but because Ian said blue. But Tom and John were even worse because Tom knew that John was kind of a vulnerable, sensitive kind of guy. And so he would just fuck with him. And he would push all of John's buttons and get him really worked up and think it was funny. And I didn't think it was funny. And I would take him aside and be like, please don't do this to my friend. It's not necessary. We're a great band. You don't need to do this. And he couldn't help himself. And after a couple of years that I couldn't do it anymore. And I left, It was difficult because, man, I'll tell you, some of the best shows I ever played was playing bass in GI, even better than Minor Threat, because those songs, I just love playing those songs. They were a bass player's songs, and at that point, I decided to do something different with my life, and I moved to LA. I had a friend from Northern Virginia who had gotten a job at Warner Special Products, the record label, and he had made some contacts at Universal's music label, and they had Universal Studios was the only place that had a music library, and they had since the 20s. The oldest building on the lot was a music library, and they needed, my friend Tom found out that they needed somebody to work in the library as an archivist, and my friend Tom was like, "You will never find a bigger music nerd. This guy knows that. This guy knows there, like literally in nothing about 20th century music that this guy doesn't know. And if he doesn't know it, he'll find out. And when he finds out, he'll learn everything about it and he'll be able to tell you." And this was the 24-year-old me. So I moved to LA and I went to work at Universal, and I was an archivist from there until 1992. And, I worked back then, TV had seasons. And I was hired under the TV, not the movie wing. And so I would have the summer off. And in the summer of 1989, I came home. And I was hanging out with John Stabb, strangely enough, in his new group house. And he was forming a new band. GI had just broken up, finally. He was forming a new band. He asked me if I'd be interested in, at least for the summer, playing with him, playing bass. I said, sure, yeah, I'm not doing anything. I was working at my old job that I'd had before, and for the summer. And I also met this really beautiful young woman in his basement who was his housemate. And that ended up being my girlfriend and then my wife, unfortunately. As history has told the story, wow, that was, if I've made a number of bad mistakes in my life, but that was the worst mistake ever. Except for my son, that was the worst mistake I ever made. But I learned a lot from it. Let me tell you, everything's there to teach you a lesson if you're willing to learn it, and I did. But so I played bass in this band. I had a really good time, but then I had to go back. And when I went back, my new girlfriend decided to come with me, so she did. And we were I'd gotten an apartment in North Hollywood, just up the street from the studio, so I would have an easy access to to work. And she got a job at a place called Bullock's, which was a department store, like Macy's, essentially, in the valley there. And on her first day of work, this crazy blonde girl jumps on her and says, "Hey, I hear you're from DC." She says, "Yeah. Do you know Minor Threat?" "My boyfriend was in Minor Threat." "What? Who's your boyfriend?" "Steve Hansgen." "Steve Hansgen's your boyfriend? Holy shit, that's so cool. We've got to be friends. We're going to be friends. We're going to be friends. We're going to be best friends." And they still are to this day, best friends.
Really? That's wild.
And this girl was named Kira Matlow. Now, Kira Matlow, I mean, we're not friends anymore. And it hurts my heart to say that, because Kira and I were very good friends, extremely good friends, very close. We bonded over having similar childhoods, let's put it that way. But she had a boyfriend at the time who was a special effects makeup artist at a place called Stan Winston Studios, which I knew about through Universal. I thought, that's cool. And so she introduces me to her boyfriend. He plays guitar. Does he? Cool. What's his name? Adam Jones. I went, oh, all right. And Adam and I met in the fall of 1990, and we hit it off. Just hit it off out of this. And I just thought he was the coolest guy. And, I loved his guitar playing. And we were talking about, the possibility of doing something together. And about 6 months later, he forms this band with this friend of his named Maynard and this guy named Danny. And we're gonna call ourselves Tool. I'm like, really? That's a cool name. And because he's an artist, he's already designed a logo and a T-shirt and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, yeah, that looks cool as shit. And so, a couple months goes by, and they have the band, and the first lineup of the band with Paul D'Amour. And I started hanging out with him. Maynard and I hit it off. I mean, Maynard didn't make friends, but Maynard and I hit it off like crazy. And I liked Paul too. I liked Paul a lot. And I finally, said, "Why didn't you ask me to play bass?" "Well, we didn't think you'd want to be in our stupid band. You were Minor Threat." Seriously. Seriously. And I was like, "Oh, all right, well." And then I saw them play their first show at this loft party in Hollywood. And I was like, "Oh my fucking God." And Nirvana hadn't broken yet. They, I knew those guys, and I knew Dave, obviously, he's from here, but they hadn't broken yet. This was in the summer of '91. They hadn't broken yet. But we knew they were gonna. I mean, we all knew they were going to. We'd all been following them for a long time. We knew they were going to break. We knew Soundgarden was going to break. We knew all that shit was coming down. And Tool were perfectly, I mean, they were perfectly settled into break with that, but it wasn't cynical. That's really what they love. They love that kind of music. They love Helmet and they love that kind of stuff. And so they were the West Coast version of that. And there wasn't a lot of that going on at that point, not LA version anyway. There was a lot of, hair bands that became grunge bands overnight when hair metal died in September of '91. Thank God. Um, but yeah, it was just like, because we didn't think you'd want to be in our stupid band. I'm like, I would have killed to be in your stupid band. I don't care about anything. I care about the music.
Yeah.
I care about my connection with the people in the band. I was already friends with you guys, and they never quite were able to have that connection with their original bass player that I would have had with them. So the next best thing I could do was, by that point, I put together a mobile recording setup, because I'd always wanted, I mean, since day one, I wanted to play music, but I wanted to know how to record it too. I was always wanting to do that. And Don had been my teacher. I'd asked him to teach me how to record at his studio, and he did. And so I had built this mobile recording thing that I mostly had set up at my house in North Hollywood, because by then I moved into this amazing house in North Hollywood. It was just a little bungalow, but it was the coolest bungalow in the world. And we had a breakfast nook, and I built my studio in it. And I just brought my stuff down to their rehearsal space in Hollywood, and recorded them live, essentially. And the demo came out like insane. And they've been trying to record stuff just to get shows, literally just to get shows in clubs. And they couldn't do it, and nothing worked. And they asked me to do it. And I said, yes, of course. So I did, and it worked great. And they were really grateful and really happy how the tape turned out. And, we had it commercially made, and they got all these great club shows. And, this is August of '91. And they started playing club shows in September. They got signed in November. And by then, Nevermind had broken, and the playing field was leveled. But they were in the right place at the right time. And they asked me, when they got their deal, they'd already picked somebody they wanted to engineer it. Sylvia Massey, just genius engineer, lovely person. Just, she and I hit it off really well. And would I co-produce it with her? I said, yeah. So I did. And that was Opiate. And so we did that at Sound City, where Nirvana had just recorded Nevermind. So it was still, the vibes are still soaked into the wood at that point. And it was a hit. It was a hit. And by the time they came back from their first tour, uh, I could already see that these guys were going to be huge stars and that I wasn't coming along for the ride. Like I could feel the distance. I could feel them getting more like, we're going to be big stars. So, we're going to have to forget the little people who helped us get where we got, you included. And I thought, all right, you know, and by that point I was like, look, I said to my girlfriend, I've been burning the candle at both ends. I've been producing bands. I've been working at Universal. I love my job, but I'm burnt out. Once again, I'd gotten to that point in my life where I was burnt out. And we had a couple of things happen that were really sort of painful situations, friendships and things that kind of went south. And we decided to head back to DC. And we came back to DC. And the very first call I got when I got home was John Stapp, whose band had broken up, and would I be interested in forming a new band with him and a guy named Danny Ingram, who'd been the drummer in Youth Brigade. He'd been a drummer in a lot of punk bands.
Yeah.
He was actually one of the first DC punks, period. And this guy named Rob Frankel, who I didn't know, but was apparently a great guitar player. And we formed this band called Appeal. And we did that for like 18 months, and that fell apart, sadly. And then I just sort of, I don't know, I just drifted for years. I just sort of was in and out of bands. I played in a lot of bands, but mostly my life was trying to figure out how to navigate my crazy girlfriend, who then became my crazy wife. And I didn't, it took me years to get a diagnosis for her. And by then I was an alcoholic, drug addict, suicidally depressed, insane person who didn't want to play music, didn't care about shit. And my psychiatrist was like, I need to save your life, but I think I know what the problem is. And, he gave me basically a list of things that would describe a acute female narcissist with borderline personality. And, does she tick any of these boxes? And by the time I got to the last box and realized that I had ticked all of them, I was like, yeah, I got to go. By then my son was 12, it was just like a thing. And I went, and it was a very, when you leave a narcissist, they make you pay for it. And, I lost my son, I lost my family, with all but 3 members of my family. I lost most of my friends, although a lot of them came back when they realized what a psychopath she is. I lost all my recording gear. I lost all of my guitars and basses, with the exception of 2. But I found this amazing woman, and her name's Holly Eni. She's been a DC punk rock girl since 1985. She's legit. She went to college, moved to Hawaii for 15 years, came back this like tall, model-esque, beautiful woman. And she saved my life. And one of the things she'd always wanted to do was play music, but no one had ever, she was only ever, the only thing that anyone ever gave a shit about was what she looked like. She was arm candy. And I knew she was way, way more than that. And so I hadn't played in ages and ages and ages. And I said, let's form a band. And this is just as the pandemic was starting and all that shit was going on. And that's when we formed Poisonous H. And she's like, I want you to play. I said, I want you to play the bass. I'm going to sing and play guitar. I'm going to front this band. She's like, I never played anything. I said, yeah, it doesn't matter. That's what punk rock's about. No one in any of the punk bands in DC in 1980 had played. Like most of these people had never played an instrument before. They just picked it up because they wanted to play. So that's what you're going to do. And I taught her to play the bass, and as it turns out, she was a natural. She learned it in like a couple of days. And suddenly we had a band, and I had a partner. I had a musical partner again. And this is a musical partner who I really, really actually, in fact, loved. Mm-hmm. And we wrote all these songs together, and we found a drummer, and we recorded an album with Don, and, we put it out, and it just was like, at the worst possible time to release a really great punk rock record because people just don't give a shit anymore about good music. They just don't care. You know, when you can push a button and have fake music made for you, why do you care about someone with talent making it? And and I was just like, you know what? We put it out there. I'm really proud of it. You know, maybe we'll do another one at some point if there's any reason to. And I'm not saying never, ever again will I play music, but I look around the world right now. I'm like, I'm not sure why there's a point. This is not what I know. There's no soul in music anymore. There's no humanity in music anymore. There's no intelligence in music. It's all woke nonsense, or it's just, people pushing a button and making it, thinking they're making music. They're not making music. And so it's just one of those things where like it'll be interesting to see where things go. And then this health crisis came up, and I had
Hmm.
something else to focus on. So, that's kind of like the story. There's lots of chunks that I left out that, better left out. But but that's pretty much it, up to this moment. I'm not saying that nothing will ever happen again. I'm sure I will play music again. I know myself. I can't stay away that long. And now that I'm getting a second chance on life, you know, after coming pretty close to buying it, um, yeah, I can see myself playing again and having it matter.
Did you, just going back a little bit then, for
Sure.
producing with Tool and Opiate,
Hmm.
Maynard is definitely considered is now, I would say, a difficult frontman in general to work with, both in the band, out of the band. Was he kind of like that when you were producing, or was that not the case then?
You could see the genesis of it.
Hmm.
He 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 is foundationally, and I'm gonna ruin his PR for him a little bit right now. And he won't probably care that it's me who's ruining it because he knows I'm telling the truth because I know him. He is a really nice guy. He is, in fact,
That was not the answer I was expecting.
a really nice guy who I got along with really well. We bonded quickly because we were both smart, funny guys who didn't take any shit from anyone because we didn't have to. I had earned the right and he just didn't. We were both severely abused children, so we bonded over that too. You can hear it in his songs, God knows. You can hear it in mine too. Um, he created a character called Maynard James Keenan. His name is James Keenan.
Hmm.
I called him Maynard because I thought it was cool. I always
Yeah.
thought of, Maynard, Bob Denver's character from Dobie Gillis, the beatnik, Maynard J. Krebs. I always thought he was the coolest guy on TV when I was a kid, and that's where it comes from, really. And he created this character, and this character kind of took over, which is often what happens when you create a character because you're trying to fix something that was broken by someone who didn't deserve you. Um, And, I never felt any need to be anything other than Steve. I was born Steve Grip. I became Steve Hansgen, and I became known as Steve Hansgen, so I stayed Steve Hansgen, even though I detest my last name, um, because of the man who gave it to me. But I never felt any need to be anybody other than myself, but Maynard did. But I knew the Maynard underneath the character because he hadn't become famous yet. He wanted to be famous. He knew he was going to be famous.
Mhm.
I didn't doubt he was going to be famous. I didn't doubt Adam was going to be famous. Um, but I never had a single moment's problem with him. When we did the demo, he was so grateful that I gave a shit enough about his band to do the best possible job I could for them. And so I read him very quickly that he needed to be in his comfort zone to do his vocals right. So I set up a comfort zone for him, and he nailed his vocals. For the demo, they were one take, and then we doubled them in one take. It took about 6 hours one afternoon. Just, you know, just one afternoon. Let's get together and do vocals at my place.
Yeah.
In the studio, and I still have the microphone. It's in the room. It's in the other room. It's still my main vocal mic. I bought this AKG vocal mic in 1991 to do my 4-track demos on at home, just so I had a decent microphone in my studio. And he sang his vocals in that mic for the demo. And then we had what at the time were $5,000-$6,000, Neumann U47s and stuff in the mic closet at Sound City, through what are now, what were then, $2,000 tube, compressors, in which are now, all of which are now, probably $500,000. And he didn't like it. He said, "Do you have the mic? Do you have your AKG? Do you have your mic that I sang on the demo with?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Go grab it." And I grabbed it, and we plugged it into one of these extremely expensive tube limiters, and it sounded fucking great. It sounded like him, and he sang into it, handheld,
Yep.
and did all of his vocals. At first he could not get his vocal. He was flipping out on me. He's like, "Why can't I sing my vocals like we did on the demo?" I think, I don't know. He's like, "Do you have the mic?" I'm like, "Yeah, I got the mic. It's in my car." And I went and grabbed it and plugged it in. And then suddenly he got them all in one take. And Sylvia was like, "Wow, that was easy." I'm like, "Yeah, it's not that hard. It's just all you have to do is he has to have a comfort zone. He has to know that people give a shit about him enough to give him a comfort zone to do what he does."
Mm-hmm.
And I did that for him. And I was the first person to do that for him. No one had ever done that for him or cared enough about what he was doing to do a good job for him. And that cemented our friendship. I haven't seen him in years, but whenever I have talked to him, there's no different. I get the real Maynard when I talk to him. I don't get the character. And I think a lot of the times these days he doesn't need that character anymore. He saves it for the stage. And he's brilliant at that. But, if he's on his ranch or whatever, he's just Maynard. But, I get his reputation. But, he became that millionaire rock star. And that robs you of your internal soul, especially the way those guys did it. And because they got involved in a lot of heavy stuff, as far as the Los Angeles music scene is concerned. My ex-wife introduced them to some not good stuff that I'd never got myself involved in, but I knew she was involved in. Let's put it this way: this stuff that I wanted nothing to do with. That's not me. I don't need that to feed my soul, and that destroys your soul when you do that, and it changes you fundamentally as a person. And so, I just sort of lost touch with them, but I never once had a hard time recording him or hanging out with him or writing with him or anything. I get why people do. And when people tell me they've had, nightmare experiences with them, I understand it, but that's not my experience at all.
To leave you with one more question, what
Sure.
is your goal, whether it's musically or just honestly anything, always being an artist? What's one more thing that you would like to do or wish you have done already?
Let's see. Well, I would love to be in another great band.
Mm-hmm.
If such a thing is even remotely humanly possible in 2026, and I don't know if it is or not, maybe it is. I would love to think that it is, especially after everything I've been through this year that got me to a very different place in my head and in my life, with the idea of a second chance at life. I would love to be in a great band. One more time. I was in a great band, so I don't want to get greedy. I was in one of the greatest bands of all time. I don't want to get greedy, but I would love to be in another great band. Uh, and actually, because I've become such a creative person. I don't know if you've heard the Poisonous H record, but that's me at my best. That is me in a nutshell. That's who I am in music. All the lessons I've learned, all the things I've learned, all the stuff I've done, that's me. Um, but I would love to do it big one more time. It would be really great. As a bass player, I think. I've learned that that's what I'm the best at. That's what I do best. I'm a fucking bass player. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, I appreciate you a ton coming on and working around our
Absolutely. My
both
pleasure.
schedules. So guys,
I
them
know it's been nuts. I apologize for that.
no, it's my fault too, to be honest. The one time was me, so it's all good. It happens. But
Yep.
thank you so much for coming on. And guys, there'll be some links down below. There'll be a link. A Day in the Life Records, of course, is my friend Dan in Lancaster. He sponsors this episode. And then also Poisonous HDC's link tree will be down below. That's probably the best way to kind of stay ahead with Steve. There's a GoFundMe. Steve is currently battling CKD. Also, there's some other interviews that he's done with the famous New York Hardcore Chronicles. And then you can get all of Poisonous H's. It has Apple, Bandcamp, Spotify, kind of everything all in one place. So it's pretty
Yep.
easy to listen to. And honestly, you could just go to Steve's Instagram itself too. And I'll link them both down below. Till next time,
Great.
guys. Peace.